Likewise. Did you guys have a good Thanksgiving?
It was fabulous. I got a puppy and a different job.
No way.
Yeah, I'm a little stressed out.
Okay.
But the puppy's great. I love my puppy.
That's great. What kind of dog is it?
He is a little mutt. He is a German Shepherd, Golden Retriever on his dad's side, and he's a Border Collie and a Boxer on his mom's side.
Oh, great. Where'd you get him?
Well, it turns out he was turned in at the police department, and then we found out later the same day that it was part of a litter that one of the police officers had actually given away the weekend before, and one of the people that took him decided they couldn't keep him, and so we got him. So it worked out great.
Oh, fantastic. That's great.
So he's a lot of fun. His name is Marty, named after St. Martin de Porres.
Oh, good. Yeah, I had a dog named Martin once.
That's great.
That's great. Outstanding. Outstanding. Good. That's good to hear.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, I thought I lost you.
Good. Yeah. So good. How are you doing, Dwayne?
Good. I know that today is Thursday now.
Right. I had seen someone logged in last night, and I was wondering, who that is. Yeah. So yeah, it must have been you. So
yeah, it was me. I logged in about 6:15 and our time here.
Okay.
And then nobody is showing up, and then I'm getting to wonder, and I checked around. Finally, it dawned on me it's Wednesday.
Right.
Oh, I'm a day early. Okay. Better that than a day late.
Right. Well, good. Well, good to hear from you. So, do you guys have any questions about the material in the last week or so? Unfortunately we missed last week, so yeah, I'm not sure what happened there. I was running behind, and I tried to call in, and I didn't get anything. So I just don't know what happened.
I don't either. It was weird because it got the same music tonight when I called, but then it went through faster. I'd waited a little while last week, about half an hour, but it just kept doing the music and come on.
Right. Yeah, that's too bad. Well, I'm sorry about that. But at any rate, so do you guys want to talk about anything from last week or this week or anything specific?
I really don't have anything specific. I am curious, though, the term paper, what day do we have to have that completed?
I'm just kind of going through my head thinking about the flow of the course. Let me ask you this. So this is sort of the last week we have scheduled for this course in terms of like lesson material. I mean, we could easily wait another week if you'd prefer.
Well, I'm coming along. I think I'm progressing all right.
Okay.
I just kind of want to know I like to know what day something has to be done, so I don't accidentally end up a couple days late.
Right. Okay. Let me look at the calendar here real quick now that you asked that, Dwayne. Hold on one second here. So yeah, so I don't think grades are going to be due until probably like the 19th or so, or the 20th.
Okay.
Maybe not even before then. So as long as I have time to grade it, it should be okay. But yes, as soon as you can get it would be good. If you want to turn it in next week, that should be fine.
Okay.
All right.
It was showing originally on the syllabus to be the 13th, but I didn't know. That was a Thursday, so I didn't really know for sure what the thought was on that.
What did it say, Sue Ellen?
It showed the 13th on the syllabus, December 13th, which is a Thursday.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So that
might have
been a mistake. But yeah, you can I think the thinking there was just to give you a few days after, you know, the end of the lesson content of the course to kind of wrap it up. And I'm not sure when's the last date you have to take the final exam. Is that on the 16th?
The 17th.
The 17th. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if it'd probably be better for you if you kind of wrapped up the term paper next week. But yeah, if you need another day or so, it's not a problem.
I'll put down in my notes here by the 13th to make sure I get it done by the 14th then.
Will that work?
Yeah, sure. The 14th should be fine.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
Alrighty.
fantastic. Now, I'm reading about Paul, and I'm still working through the essay that you assigned this week, so I'm not well versed on that. But
Okay.
I'm enjoying this thought process. I had never thought about the whole Judaism and Augustine and that whole thing going on.
Okay.
So I'm still
Yeah.
working through.
Right. Okay.
I'm trying to find my printout on that article on Paul because I did not get it completed yet. I got most of it read, but I thought it was really, really interesting.
Okay. Good. That's good. Yeah. I'd hoped you would find it interesting. If you take our Paul course, it's kind of taught along that vein. So it's a little bit different than kind of the standard approach to Paul that predominated most of the, you know, post-Reformation era, you know, and really which traces back in a couple of respects to Augustine. So, but I, you know, I think it's a good reading of Paul. I think it makes much better sense of the text than the older reading does. So, but both of Romans and Galatians. So, yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because most of the, you know, people who are, you know, new perspective oriented scholars of Paul are non-Catholic. So that's also something that's kind of interesting as well. So,
One thing about Paul, it's always difficult for me to read Paul, especially when I'm lecturing at church. His sentences can be so long and run out that one's got to really think on that. It's not as simple reading as most of the rest of the Bible.
no, that's for sure, because it's discourse, so it's not narrative. So that makes them a little more difficult because there's a lot of arguments and you know, demonstrations, and you know, sometimes he'll be in dialogue with a particular objection, and you won't really know that he's in dialogue with an objection because he sort of assumes that on the part of his audience, but because they might have sent him a correspondence already, but it's not spelled out in the text. I mean, you know, that's the added challenge of Paul, is that when you read these letters, you're really reading someone else's mail.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we always have to take a long, deep breath before you lecture if you're reading Paul.
Absolutely, and there's sometimes I've created my own period in a sentence there too with him.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So
The N.T. Wright article is the one that you guys were speaking of specifically. That's the one is that the one you were talking about just now?
Yes, yeah, that's the one. I don't see in my things right here. I don't know where I left that, but I was reading into that, and I thought it was quite interesting.
It really is. I haven't gotten all the way through it yet either, so I'm still working on that. But he's always good. N.T. Wright's always been a good writer when I've had other things I had to read from him.
I think this is the first time I've been exposed to him that I'm aware of.
yeah.
What can we expect on the final exam? Will it be a lot like the last one that we had?
No. Almost nothing like the last one. Basically,
Okay.
Most of the exam, and I'll tell the rest of the class this. I'm actually recording this as well. So the lion's share of the exam is going to be, kind of an essay on method C, and that would be, what you see as the strengths and weaknesses of method A and method B respectively. So method A, just to review, would be, the sort of traditional approach to the Bible, going back to the, time of the Renaissance and before. So that would be the church fathers and medievals. And maybe you could even throw in, Luther and Calvin too, although they're in some way they're transitional figures. We looked at them. But what are some of the distinctive marks of the traditional approach to the scriptures? And then method B would be the more scientific approach to scriptures, which really had its roots in the 17th century. Really was anticipated in many respects by the ancient figures as well. I mean, it was not entirely new, but it really sort of got established and more systematically in the 17th century, but really got going in the 19th and 20th centuries. And what were some of the distinctive marks of that brand of scholarship? And, how do you think going forward we can or should, develop a method C, which is what Joseph Ratzinger talked about in his in that dialogue I had you read, which kind of takes advantage of the strengths of method A and B, but tries to avoid the respective weaknesses of each of them. So that's kind of it. For that question, some detailed information would be fine, but it's more just seeing if you understand kind of the big picture and seeing how what your take on the whole question is, of what we should do going forward, that kind of thing. So that's the basic question. So that's about 70% of the grade. Now, I do ask you some short answer questions. They're not multiple choice, although I was thinking about actually, redoing it to be multiple choice rather than being open response. But I haven't changed it yet, and I don't know that I'll have a chance to. But pretty much what I ask in the multiple choice are just a little bit of the stuff in the second half of the course. And I can pull up to kind of remind myself, but it would be, the different forms of criticism that we looked at: text criticism, source criticism, form criticism, redaction criticism, literary criticism. Like what are all those forms of criticism? What's distinct about them? What do each of them do? That kind of thing. So we spent a little bit of time on each of those. In a couple cases, I actually had you kind of try your hand at them a little bit. So that would be one. And then I think I ask, in fact, if you don't mind, let me pull up the exam here real quick, and I can refresh my own memory what I ask. So let's see. All right. Let us take a look. I don't really ask a whole lot, prior to the emergence of method B. So it's good to know that in kind of general terms, but I don't ask a lot of specifics about that. So let me see here. In terms of specific information, it's more second half of the course, but let me go ahead and see if I can find this here. Exam. Here we are. Okay. And you are allowed to use a Bible in the exam. An
unmarked Bible, correct?
Yeah, unmarked Bible, right, exactly. Okay, so in addition to the kinds of criticisms which we can go over, I do ask you to kind of summarize some of the key figures we looked at, just identify them accurately, who they were, what they did. You don't need, more than a short paragraph, few sentences on each one, maybe at most. But you have a choice of answers as well. So Ricard Simon and Jean-Luc Astruc were one of them, and they were the ones who, if you remember, found, on a close analysis of the book of Genesis, well, actually the first 5 books of the Bible, that they seem to really be kind of a patchwork quilt, that really there seemed to be like 2 or 3 different sources that were sort of put together. And the sources traditionally are labeled J for the Yahweh source and P for the priestly source. Now, traditionally, there's also an E source, which is an Elohist source, although not too many people think that there really is an Elohist source. And there's also a D source, which is the Deuteronomic source. So basically, they discovered that the Pentateuch is kind of a patchwork quilt. Some of the passages in the Pentateuch belonging to J are probably some of the oldest parts of the Pentateuch. The P sections are later, and the D sections are the latest, although some people think that P follows D, but that's not necessary that all those details. So and that sort of gave birth to the whole concept of what we came to be known as diachronic criticism. So diachronic analysis would be an analysis of the text that sort of takes seriously the different time periods in which the various parts of the text come from. So, for instance, a good example that might be looking at, the book of Genesis, for instance, and realizing that there's 2 creation stories, the first one and the second one. The first one, goes from Genesis 1 to the first few verses of Genesis 2. The second one is Genesis 2 and 3 with the story of the fall. Those 2 different creation stories come from 2 different time periods. Most interpreters think that the first one comes from the time of the exile, and it's in some respects a response to the Babylonian story. The second one seems to be older than that one and seems to go back to the monarchical period. That's the reigning hypothesis. But at any rate, the point is that the diachronic approach would sort of take seriously reading these 2 stories independently and trying to interpret them according to their own respective historical context. And so given that they're 2 different ones, we have 2 different historical contexts. So that would be diachronic. Another example of diachronic would be looking at the book of Isaiah. Some portions of the book of Isaiah go back to the 8th century when the prophet was actually alive and preaching. Some of it, comes to the 6th century or so when the prophet, had been dead for over a century, but probably had disciples that were attempting to apply his original oracles to the new situation of the Babylonian exile. So if you read some parts of Isaiah, you'll see some parts are older than other parts. A diachronic analysis will attempt to take seriously the various historical contexts that the different parts come to us in. Okay. Now, a synchronic, by comparison, would be the analysis that you're probably instinctively more familiar with, and that would be the one that attempts to make sense of the final form of the text, as we have it, apart from the various periods of history, that the text may have come into being at. Okay, if that makes any sense. So typically, an informed synchronic reading will attempt to learn from a diachronic approach, but will really try to interpret the text in its final form. So those are 2 types of approaches to the Bible that came about, really, that began in the 17th century with Ricard Simon and Jean-Luc Astruc with the Pentateuch. But recognizing that same approach was probably generalizable to other parts of the Bible as well. The Psalms are like that as well. Some Psalms are older and pre-exilic. Some Psalms are probably exilic. So when you read each one, you take advantage. You pay attention to what in history, if we can reasonably determine it, what in history is this particular text responding to? Okay, does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
That's one question. Okay, you don't have to do that question. That's just one of the questions on there. Okay. Another one I asked about is the synoptic problem. What is the synoptic problem? What are the various solutions to the problem? Why is it relevant for biblical research and interpretation? Again, I'm not expecting a book on this. A short paragraph will do if you basically understand what it is that we're talking about there. Okay.
Yes, sir.
There's a short question on Rudolf Bultmann. Who is Rudolf Bultmann? What is his form criticism? What are the main problems of this approach from a Catholic standpoint? Okay, that kind of thing. So again, a paragraph will do. Another possible question is Albert Schweitzer. I think I gave you 10 of these kind of shortish answer questions, and you can choose, I think, six of them. Okay, so
Yes, sir.
okay, so you don't have to get all of them, but as long as you get most of them, you'll be in good shape. So I asked a question about Albert Schweitzer, who he is, why he's important. I asked a question about historical criticism. What is historical criticism? What are some of the criteria that historical critics use to defend the basic historicity of the material in the Gospels, and what are legitimate uses of such work in the church? What are some limitations of it? Okay, so that's one. I ask another question, what's redaction criticism and literary criticism? I just mentioned that one before. What's the critical realism of N.T. Wright? We spent a lesson on that. What's the work of Kenneth Bailey and Richard Balcom in looking at the ways the church actually told stories about Jesus? Why is this approach probably more promising than form criticism of Rudolf Bultmann? That's a good question. And then just a question on the new perspective. Again, these are all kind of shortish answer questions, like a paragraph, decent sized paragraph will do for each one of them. Okay, so you want to go over some of these, or what do you guys want to do?
That would be great. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm sorry.
good. All right.
Sure.
So let me ask you. Let me kind of ask you the question. Let you take the lead. So first of all, let's look at briefly the different kinds of text criticism. Now, again, this is standard. This is not really advanced stuff, and you guys knowing this, but it's something you should know. In fact, when I teach Intro New Testament undergrad, this is something that I have all students learn, just so they know that what's going on in the different techniques that modern scholars use, and what they're designed to do, and what the limitations are. So what is text criticism? Do you guys remember that one?
I'm looking, I'm remembering slowly.
I'll give you a hint. You remember when we looked at, actually, maybe we didn't do this in this class. I'm trying to remember. But we, like there's some versions of the Gospel of Luke that have the saying from Jesus on the cross saying, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And there's other versions that don't have that. There's some versions that in the agony of the Garden of Gethsemane that have the sweat of Jesus falling like drops of blood to the ground. Other versions don't have that. Did we talk about that at all?
Well, it tries to detect variations from one book to another, the text differences in the text, to analyze the text, the differences from, I say, for example, the agony in the garden as to what is said in each of the Gospels about that.
Oh, no. So that would be source criticism. That would be synoptic problem. So yeah, so text criticism would just look at all the versions of the Gospel of Luke of antiquity that we have, any papyri that we have, any codices that we have, those sorts of things, and look at the various differences of the text of Luke. Okay,
within the same gospel.
Or it could be a Pauline letter, or it could be the book of Revelation. It could be anything, right? Any book of the New Testament, and compare the various versions we have and try as closely as possible to reconstruct the original text.
Was this the part that came out mostly during the Renaissance?
Yeah. So the Renaissance really got this started. That's right.
And to find the best Bible possible, right?
Yes, exactly. The search for the better Bible and the search for different manuscripts to try to find the most accurate Bible possible that could be reconstructed. Okay.
So was involved in all that, or was he was before that though, wasn't he?
Who's this?
Erasmus?
Yeah, Erasmus did a lot of work on text criticism. Yep, for sure.
Okay.
Erasmus was one of the people that put together what became known as the majority text. Yes, which became the basis of the King James Bible. Okay, but so really there were lots of texts though discovered in the 19th century. Whole biblical manuscripts were recovered. Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, Ephraemi Rescriptus, to go along Codex Alexandrinus, to go along with Codex Bezae. So all of these codices are more or less complete versions of the whole New Testament, and they date back to the 3rd, 4th, and 5th and 6th centuries. So those are kind of the main sources that interpreters would look at to try to reconstruct the original New Testament as closely as possible. Okay.
Right.
From the textual variants. And that's an ongoing project. Okay. So that work will never be complete because there's always new little bits of evidence that are kind of trickling in, but the enormous finds of the 19th century really, sort of nudged the Pope Leo XIII to begin to accept the results of text criticism and to begin it, and then Pius the 12th, at that point ordered a new Bible based on the results of what had been mostly a Protestant effort, to some extent ecumenical, but mostly a Protestant effort to really reconstruct the biblical text from the ancient sources. So now in the 20th century, the Bible that you have, probably the RSV or the NRSV or the New American, one of those, any modern one, and the Protestants have the same ones, just slightly different translations. But all modern translations except the King James is based on the Scholar's Bible, which is the Nestle Aland, which is the reconstruction of the original Greek New Testament, given all the available sources. So they're sort of the same source text that everybody is using. Okay, and you'll see, of course, in the margins of your Bible, various alternative readings, and those are put there not because those are the only alternative readings that are available, but they're the ones either that scholars are really not sure about, or they're there because there's a strong tradition attached to them, and so for that reason, they're put there so that if the Bible doesn't sound right, if it seems to leave something out, why it's been left out. Okay, some versions read this, and the implication is other versions don't read it. Okay, so there are lots of examples of textual variants, but this is sort of the basic criticism, and I call this low criticism in the lesson. So this is kind of the basic modern criticism that, so in a certain sense, all other criticisms depend on. And this is also the one that's the least controversial. Although sometimes the results are controversial, but the practice of it is not controversial. Everybody recognizes that it needs to be done.
Makes sense.
Okay?
Yes, sir.
All right, good. So does that make sense, Dwayne?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, so text criticism. So once you've established the text of the Bible, then the second question comes up. Okay, where did the actual text come from? Now, with most of the books, it's not that interesting a question because it would have come from the author, and the author probably wasn't borrowing any other sources, although maybe he was from time to time. But for instance, when Paul wrote Romans, occasionally he'll make direct quotations from the Old Testament. And, of course, the question is, well, what version is he using? And is he changing the version at all to support what he's saying? Is he making little minor changes to it, or does he just have a different version? That's a question for source criticism. Okay, and likewise, another type of source criticism would be what we just talked about with the Pentateuch, where you have, say, two stories of creation. One story is in Genesis 1, the other story is in Genesis 2 and 3. Where do each of those come from? How do they date? Where does one begin? Where does the other end? That kind of thing. So those are questions of source criticism. Okay, so source criticism is another question. When you're looking at the Synoptic Gospels, okay, if you're looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke closely, the question is, where did Luke get his material from? Where did Matthew get his material from? When Matthew gives us his infancy narrative, where did he get that from, that story? Well, we don't know, but we want to mark that as being sort of at least something that belongs specifically to Matthew and not confuse it with what we find in Luke. In Luke chapter 1 and 2, Luke's material is quite a bit different. Where did he get his material from? We don't know, but we want to at least notionally separate that material from Matthew's infancy narrative. Okay, the various stories that we find in Luke and Matthew, where did they get those from? Well, probably they got them from Mark, but maybe they got them from other places too, because Luke has a lot of special stories that only exist in his gospel. So all this is source criticism, but it's sort of tied up with the synoptic problem as well. The synoptic problem is sort of source criticism applied to the gospels. Okay?
Yes, sir.
If you take the course in Isaiah, you'll see that, various portions of the book come from probably different time periods. Where did they come from? The various portions of the book, what time period, and what was going on with each of them? That's sort of a question for source criticism. Okay. All right. So you've got text criticism there, establishing what the text was. Source criticism is sort of, what are the various strata of the text, which are the earlier portions of the text, which are the later portions of the text, that kind of thing. So if you could imagine doing archaeology and you do an archaeological dig, the further and further you dig down, the deeper and deeper into the past you get. Okay, the more recent stuff is going to be on top, and the older stuff is going to be in the bottom. And in fact, you can oftentimes find cities that are built on other cities, or buildings that are built on top of other buildings, because the old ones get buried and new ones get built on top of them. So it's kind of analogous to what a source critic does. He'll look for, in a book like Isaiah, some of the older portions of the text versus some of the newer portions of the text, okay? So that's source criticism, and we talked about that a little bit, mostly with regard to the Pentateuch, but it also ties into the synoptic problem. And indeed, there's some kind of a source critical question for almost any book of the Bible. Probably a more interesting source criticism from a traditional Catholic standpoint would be, how does a New Testament book use an Old Testament book? Okay, that's a source critical question. What book is being used? Why? That's a very interesting question to know in a lot of cases, because it sheds a lot of light on what the New Testament is saying. Okay, so all right, so that's source criticism. So form criticism. Can you tell me what form criticism is? Do you guys remember that one?
Not well enough to describe it.
Sue Ellen?
I remember it had something, Volkan had part of it, and then we also read something about it with Buckham, and they had a different spin on it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Okay. Good.
But I don't. I think it was like it was something about how the hearing and the oral communications came together, and
good.
I'm sorry, but it was something that based on how you heard it or how it was presented afterwards in the speech, or.
Okay.
I'm a little.
Yeah,
I'm not sure about
it's a little fuzzy. That's fine. So form criticism is basically flows from the realization that, and the realization sort of makes sense, that a lot of times when you have a story that tells us about the past, it's going to tell us more, or at least as much, about the time period in which it's written than it will about the time period to which it refers.
Yes.
Okay.
I remember reading this. Yes.
So as an example, to pick a World War II movie, or I think the example I use in the lesson would be the stories of the Battle of Little Bighorn, right? So
yes.
Called She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, which is written shortly after World War II, which is developed then. And then you have a movie called Little Big Man, which is made in the 70s, okay, in the sort of post-Vietnam era. So those two stories are movies are going to tell us about the story, but they're going to tell us a lot more about, what's going on with the people in that particular society than they will about the actual history of Little Bighorn. And so the insight of form criticism is that there's, an oral tradition that sort of precedes the written tradition of the story, and that the oral tradition really it's a window into the community that was telling that tradition at a particular time. Okay, so as an example, the form critical approach to the story of Little Bighorn would be to look at those two movies and say, okay, one is post-Vietnam. There's a lot of American uncertainty. There's a lot of guilt about the treatment of non-white peoples that's embedded there. So that's one thing that you see with one of the approaches. The other one is it's very much rah-rah patriotic spirit, World War II, that kind of thing. So in other words, the story in this case is sort of a window into what's going on at the period of time. And of course, if you apply that to the Bible, you will look at different stories. Go back again once more to the creation story. Creation story 1 in Genesis 1, creation story 2 in Genesis 2 and 3. And not think so much about the actual creation itself, which is, an event which took place a long time before, but see if you can let yourself see through those stories to the various people that would have given rise to those particular stories. What was going on in that particular history? So it's related to source criticism, and indeed, form criticism presupposes source criticism, because if you don't have sources that you can confidently date to particular periods of time, there's really nothing for a form critic to do. So, we that would be one approach. Another approach, when you apply form criticism to the New Testament, the way Bultmann did, you would look at how Jesus is portrayed in various periods of time. Paul would be the oldest of the New Testament writers. How does he portray Jesus compared to how Mark and Matthew and Luke and John portray him? And what does that tell us, not so much about Jesus himself, but what does it tell us about the various development of, the various Christian communities to which these various works, originated from? What does it tell us about the Pauline communities that for Bultmann, they're not talking a whole lot about the history of Jesus himself, what he did and what he said. They're interested primarily in the fact that he died and rose from the dead. So does that mean that the stories arose later? And if so, why did they arise later, and what purpose did they serve in the various later communities which they arose from? So that would be Bultmann's approach. Okay. Now, since we're on Bultmann, of course, the main problem from a Catholic standpoint is that Bultmann has, in effect, given up on the historic basis of the Gospels, and has sort of reduced the message in the New Testament to, simply of the stories being simply a vehicle for various theological claims made by the early church. And if that's true, then, do we really even have a religion at all, or do we just have a philosophy? If there's no historical basis to anything, right? And so that's the obvious problem from a Catholic standpoint, is that, you don't really have a historical, you don't have a religion anymore as we understand it. You have just a philosophy. Okay. But you see this form critical assumptions, entering, and not all form criticism is bad. I should hasten to point out, some insights are, of form criticism are solid. The idea that there was an oral tradition before the written Gospels is pretty much, widely, if not universally, agreed to. And that the oral tradition probably went through some stages of development is also seems fairly well established, and that there were that the oral tradition before the Gospels were written probably was fairly similar to what the written form of the Gospels was at the time the Gospels were written. So those are all things that are fairly widely agreed to. Okay, but jumping ahead to Balcom and Bailey, what Balcom and Bailey, have done is shown that probably the oral tradition method of telling stories in the early church was not nearly as creative and tendentious as Bultmann assumed, right? Where you could simply, invent whole new traditions of stories that Jesus did things and said things, and, have people just accept it. That rather that the model of telling stories seems a lot more conservative and a lot more a much more stable process of transmission than what Bultmann and the early form critics assumed. And so that was sort of Bailey's contribution. And then Bultmann's contribution is to bring in this idea of eyewitnesses, that in fact, maybe the eyewitnesses were really the ones who stabilized the tradition, the ones that in effect certified the tradition in the early church. So that's form criticism. Does that sort of make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Okay, good.
I enjoyed reading about Balcom and Bailey. It was very interesting, I thought.
Yeah. So those are interesting books, and you may not have total time to finish them now, but do read them later, because they're both of them are very interesting authors. And if either you teach New Testament, even at a parish level, obviously the historical questions are ones that are going to come up frequently. So, and also the way people told stories in antiquity. So in the relationship of the told stories about Jesus to the written stories that we have in the Gospels, these are questions that are not going to go away. So these are obviously very important questions that you should ask. Okay, so or that you should be able to discuss with students. So what was I going to say? Okay, the synoptic problem. So what is the synoptic problem? Do you want to discuss that briefly?
Well, that the synoptic problem is that they're not all three identical books.
Right.
That would be to begin with. Mark being so much shorter. For centuries, they thought that he was an abbreviation of Matthew.
Right.
But through all this criticism, it's actually, no, he was first, and the others used him and expanded.
Right.
And then, of course, how do you explain that Matthew and Luke have some identical sentences that are not in Mark? Where'd they come up with these? Did they know each other? Did
Right.
they sit down some evening and hash this out, or
Right.
Where'd they get this?
Right, exactly. So the Gospels all are way too similar to think that they're all completely independent of one another, and yet there's enough differences to suggest that there's some kind of redaction going on from one to another. So the synoptic problem attempts to answer which is the oldest Gospel and how do the three synoptic Gospels relate to one another. So you sort of nailed the main solution, which is Mark in priority, and then the second solution within that is, well, how do you explain the similarities between if Matthew and Luke both borrowed from Mark and the main Markan story to describe the flow of Jesus' ministry and the passion, which they would have gotten from Mark. How do you explain the materials that aren't found in Mark that Matthew and Luke also agree on? And these would be, various sayings. The way that they tell the baptism is very similar. The Beelzebub story is very similar. So there's a bunch of stories that they have that really seem to overlap with one another. And a lot of sayings as well. The Lord's Prayer is very similar as well. So how do we explain that? And so one explanation is, well, they each redacted a separate saying source called Q, from the German word Quelle, which means source. Another hypothesis is that Luke borrowed from Matthew. So that's another one. Now, of course, some people think that Matthew is the oldest gospel, and if that were the case, Matthew and Luke probably had some relationship as well, and then Mark would have come along and synthesized Matthew and Luke. Not too many people think that anymore, but that is a view that is held by some people. Okay, so why is the synoptic problem important? Well, for one thing, it allows us to do redaction criticism of the Gospels. And what is redaction criticism?
Sorry, I lost y'all for a minute. Redaction. I was looking at that a couple of days ago.
Finding the original text, the original.
That's text criticism.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's depending upon how they leave parts out and put parts in and.
Okay.
Yeah. So right. So exactly. So if Matthew borrowed from Mark, say a particular story, that is featured in both Matthew and Mark, how did Matthew change Mark and why? Okay, so that's a question for redaction criticism. Okay, what edits did he make to Mark? Were they simply improving the grammar? Was he adding certain things? Was he taking out certain things? And if we can sort of look at a whole bunch of different ways in which Matthew would have redacted Mark, maybe we can get some kind of insight into Matthew's theology if we can detect certain tendencies that he has. So one obvious tendency, which I think I pointed out to you, is that in every case in which a story from Mark has the disciples calling Jesus teacher, in that parallel story in Matthew, they will always be calling him Lord. Okay?
Right.
So there's obviously some kind of a Christological motive there, or theological motive. Not that Mark doesn't think that Jesus is divine, but that Matthew really wants to sort of underscore this as being something that was clearly noted by the apostles, the disciples going back to the very beginning. Okay, or at least that they're seeing him as possibly specially sent from God, right? So redaction criticism attempts to establish certain tendencies, certain things that Matthew tends to include, certain things that he tends to leave out. Okay, and if you look at it in the Greek, you can see that there's a lot of really interesting changes that flow from one to the next. In terms of the language used, certain types of expressions, that sort of thing. Okay, so that's redaction criticism. Same question with Luke and borrowing Mark. So if Luke borrowed from Mark, how did Luke change his Markan source? How did he stick with his Markan source? So these are all different questions that are essential for redaction criticism. So if we did a systematic study of Luke's commentary, and we started out by comparing the Markan parallel, we probably would learn a lot about Luke just from systematically comparing him to Mark with material that's in parallel. Okay, so that's redaction criticism. Redaction criticism usually lends itself to helping us to see the theology of the biblical writers. What were you saying, Sue Ellen?
Well, I was wondering if what Luther did when he changed some of the words, if that was something that's like redaction criticism, where he was changing the words from, say, church to be community, or if that was just his choice.
Yeah, that's not redaction criticism. That would just be him translating it differently.
Just translated differently. Okay, yeah. I was just making sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So redaction criticism would be, it's done by the biblical writers themselves, not by translators. Yeah.
All right, that helps me. Thank you.
Okay. Similarly, if you see various places in which, say, one of the writers borrows from the New Testament, does he change his text at all? Some of them will make minor modifications to the text of the Old Testament, which they're borrowing from. Okay, and it's good to know how they've done that and why. That's also, a source/redaction criticism question. Honey.
Good still.
Yeah. Okay. So, what else? I think that's probably about it. So if you can kind of grasp most of what I've just gone over there, you should be in pretty good shape.
It's very helpful. I appreciate you taking time to go over it with us.
Oh, no problem.
Yes.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
No problem. So if you guys have any more questions,
Yeah, I do have one question.
feel free to ask me, but you can ask me now if you like. Go ahead.
Yes. You mentioned a book called Eucharist and Eschatology by Jeffrey Wainwright.
Yeah. Did you find it?
No, I'm not familiar with it, but I made note of it in my notes here. Is that an easy book to read, or is that quite heavy reading, or?
It's a scholarly book, but it's designed to be sort of, for people at your level, getting a master's degree. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
The thing is, at your level, Dwayne, nothing should be really over your head, right? So.
Yeah, I know. I have to read a lot of this. I have to read through a second time. A lot of the, the lessons, when we read them, I'll read through it the first time and highlight a lot of things. Then a couple of days later, I read through it a second time, and then things make much more sense, and I highlight more things.
Okay, that's good.
Material.
Good, excellent. All right. So good. So know the various criticisms. Oh, Albert Schweitzer. We should go over him real quickly. What did he do? You guys remember Schweitzer?
Oh, I remember him, but now I can't remember specifically what he did.
Okay.
He was a Renaissance man. We know that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's good. Got it. He has a big bushy mustache. Renaissance man. Yeah.
Yeah.
Those bushy mustaches were common in the late 19th century, I think.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
He didn't have to shit that way.
Yeah. So Schweitzer. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. That's fine.
Schweitzer was a New Testament scholar, among other things, and so pretty much what Schweitzer's famous for is the heightened emphasis on eschatology in the actual message of Jesus and of Paul, for that matter. Okay, what Schweitzer really went on to kind of show was that the preaching of Jesus is very, very much connected to the coming of the kingdom of God, right? And you cannot understand Jesus as a moral preacher or teacher, who's giving us sort of timeless principles for the way we should live. That understanding is going to be bound to be inaccurate if you do not also understand that the preaching of Jesus, the message of Jesus, is all geared to produce certain behaviors in the church that are all associated with the imminent coming of God's kingdom, right? If you read the Sermon on the Mount, and that's something that, I sort of suggested that you do just as for fun, or, read Matthew's gospel, Mark's gospel, Luke's gospel, any of those gospels, Jesus won't go too far in his preaching or teaching before he refers to something of the coming of the kingdom, the coming of future judgment, the separation of the sheep and the goats, the separation of the good fish from the bad fish, the good fruit from the bad fruit, which will be thrown into the fire, that kind of thing. So there's always this eschatological ring to what Jesus says, and you can't really capture the man accurately if you ignore those things. And for a variety of reasons, both the liberal critics in the 19th century and sort of mainstream churchmen before had tended to de-emphasize that aspect of the message for different reasons. Okay, but what Schweitzer really showed was you can't really separate out that part of the message. Okay, and this is sort of an eternal, evergreen kind of moral, Christological truth that's valid for us as much as it was for them in the early church, or in Schweitzer's day. That we can't turn the gospel into simply a code of conduct, for the long haul without recognizing the sort of centrality of the coming of the kingdom. And that's sort of at the heart of the message. Now, of course, Schweitzer went wrong in that he sort of went so far with the eschatology that he kind of exaggerated the eschatology to turn Jesus into someone who predicted the imminent coming of the kingdom, and that failed to happen. Okay, so he was wrong, but in a certain sense, but for the right reasons. But nowadays, everybody recognizes the importance of eschatology. And indeed, recovering the eschatology, the eschatological message of the New Testament is very much at the heart of, the kind of scholarship that I do when I teach the stuff or write on it, or that, most modern scholars are focused on, of sort of getting modern Christians to understand that the coming of the kingdom is really the central message of Jesus. And if we forget that, we're almost certain to be distorted in our understanding of what Jesus and the church are really all about. Okay, so that's Schweitzer. Okay. So Schweitzer, a very influential figure today, even though he's been dead for, 70, 80 years.
Well, and he wrote that book when he was really young. He was only,
Right.
what, 30 or something, or 20-something, and people still read it today.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's really considered a blessing to write anything in any scholarship in the humanities that anybody remembers, more than 6 months after you've read it. And so to have something that people are still talking about 100 years later is really impressive.
Right.
Yeah. So at any rate, that's Schweitzer. So he's important as well. And so, looking at Schweitzer is one of the reasons that Bultmann kind of went the direction he did, was that, Bultmann really wanted to get away from the eschatology. And the only way to really do it honestly is through demythologization, right? So that was really Bultmann's, the centerpiece of what Bultmann was trying to do with his new interpretation of Christianity, because the eschatological picture of a coming kingdom is just going to look very dated to us. It's going to seem really kind of weird. It'll seem a little bit too ethnocentric. It'll seem a little bit too Jewish, too triumphalistic. It just won't really fit into the typical vibe that Christianity in the 19th and 20th century typically has, which is more about brotherly love and let's be nice to one another, let's be kind, let's not commit adultery, that kind of thing. So in other words, all that's true, of course, but the message of Jesus is quite a bit more radical in some respects, and that was one of the things that, because of Schweitzer, Bultmann really felt he had to go the direction that he did, which was in effect pull the New Testament out of the historical context of the first century and think of a new way in which it could have a context in the 20th century. And that's demythologization, and that's basically turn it into a philosophy rather than a religion. Okay?
Sounds good.
Okay, very good.
All right. Well, listen, you guys, thanks a lot. And
Thank
you.
I'll see you later in the discussion forum, okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Good night. Good night, Dwayne.
Good night.
You, Ellen.
Good night.
Okay. We've got a few people here from the next group. Give me like 1 second, okay? And I'm gonna go ahead and log out, then log back in again, okay? Okay.
Okay.
All right. Let me see here how to do this.